So welcome back to the channel. If you've seen my recent video on how I went from Fuji to Sony, you'll realise that I've not only gone from APS-C to full frame, but I've gone from medium format to full frame. So I've gone up and I've gone down. In a previous video, I also looked at diffraction. And I looked at diffraction on APS-C cameras and I looked at diffraction on medium format cameras. In the video, I explained what diffraction was and what the limits are on particular sensor sizes. So now that I'm in the Sony ecosystem, as it were, I thought I would update the previous video to look at full frame diffraction. So before we go too far, let's have a quick look at what diffraction is if you haven't seen the previous video. As the light comes through our lens, if we've got a wide aperture, that light comes in pretty much straight and it hits the sensor pretty much straight. As we close our apertures down, the light is bent. The further we close that aperture down, the further the light is bent. And the more acute that light hits the sensor, the more likely we are to get diffraction. Basically what's happening is as the light is hitting one pixel, it is actually overlapping into the pixel next door to it. Now diffraction varies from camera to camera and it will depend on pixel density, it will depend on sensor size, and it will depend on aperture. There is no set point at which diffraction kicks in. You have to experiment with your camera. But what you will see is if you stop your camera down to a really small aperture, say f16, f22, you'll see a slight softening of the image. And the smaller that aperture becomes, the more pronounced that softening will become. It's not like motion blur, it's not like even being out of focus. It's a very intangible quality. But the only way you tend to see it is if you do an experiment and you shoot through the aperture range and you start to see that softness creeping in. Now, as I said, I did a video before with my Fuji cameras and I've gone back to the same location and I've repeated this shoot with my full frame Sony. So I've shot all the way from wide open down to f22, the same subjects, a brick wall quite close up and a shot of the cathedral in the distance. I've used the camera on a tripod and I've used a 2-second countdown to eliminate any camera shake. It's a mirrorless camera, so we've not got any mirror slap. And I've used autofocus in exactly the same point each time. So let's get into Lightroom and we'll take a look at just where diffraction kicks in on a 61 megapixel full frame sensor. So as you can see, I have the images now in Lightroom from the Sony. I used the 24-105. It's an f4 lens, so we've shot from f4 all the way to f22. We've done a close-up shot and we've done a distance shot. And let's have a little deep dive into the images and see how they look. So this is the first image. This was taken at f4. As I said, the focus was autofocus in exactly the same position each time. The camera was on a tripod and I used a 2-second countdown to avoid any contact with the actual camera. That looks pretty sharp. I can't see anything wrong with that. That's at 200% and that looks pretty good. If we go to f5.6, I would say that actually got very slightly sharper at 5.6. So we're beginning to creep into the sweet spot for the actual lens at 5.6. And at f8 again looks very similar to f5.6. I would say at f8 it's even slightly sharper. So I would say we're probably looking at a sweet spot of between 5, 6 and 8 on the 24-105. Let's have a look at 11. Now at 11, there's a very slight softening of the image. That might be the lens, that might be the very beginnings of diffraction, difficult to tell. Let's go to f16. And by f16, you can definitely start to see there's some softening of the image, and that is diffraction kicking in definitely at 16, but possibly 11. And lastly, let's go over to f22 and you can see there diffraction is really quite pronounced. The words have become much more blurry in the actual image. These cobwebs here are much less defined. Let's go back and let's take f8, which was a sweet spot, and we'll compare it to f22 side by side. and you've got F22 on the left here and F8 on the right here, you can see there's really a significant difference. That's a very, very good demonstration of the effect of diffraction on your images, particularly at smaller apertures. So let's go back to the grid and we'll do the same on the longer view, the further away view. There's been no sharpening, no corrections to any of these images. So this is a f4 and 200%. Looks pretty reasonable, fairly sharp, lots of definition in the brickwork here. Coming to 5.6, again, we've got a slight sharpening there at 5.6, which I think is as we head towards the sweet spot of the lens. And at f8, again, a slight sharpening again at f8. So definitely the sweet spot on this lens is around about f8 for the 24-105. Coming to f11, and looking at f11, there is a slight softening there at f11. So I think we're looking at the beginnings of diffraction just creeping in around f11. Going to f16, there is a definite drop in sharpness, overall sharpness in the image. If you look at f11 and then look at f16, we've got a definite drop in sharpness there. And coming to f22, again, you could see there's a very, very big dip in the sharpness of the image there. And again, let's go to the sweet spot, which was f8, and compare them side by side once again. And as you can see, we've got f8 on the right, f22 on the left, and there is a significant difference in image sharpness between those two apertures. You are definitely seeing diffraction on the left image there at f22. So I hope this video has been interesting. Diffraction is a often misunderstood issue. People take a lot of photos at very small apertures and wonder why they're unsharp. Often they think it might be some sort of camera shake, might defect in the lens or something like that, when in fact very often it is diffraction, and it's something you need to be aware of. If you're doing a shot that's really critical for sharpness, then you might want to look at hyperfocal focusing at a more moderate aperture, or focus stacking, which will allow you to stack a number of images focused at various points through the scene and stack them in Photoshop, which will give you a better range of sharpness. So f22 is certainly not an aperture I'd be using if I was looking for the ultimate in sharpness. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you had a thumbs up would be great. If you've really liked it, a subscription would be even better. If you have any questions about diffraction, I'm happy to answer them in the comments below, and I will see you in the next one.